A man hangs by his bound wrists, elbows torn, suspended from a beam. He's neither bandit nor soldier in this count. The chronicler records him as accused. Stone walls echo the scrape of rope on skin, and the hush of a scribe recording every gasp. The scene begins without times or place, with only the fact of suffering and a pen that will turn pain into legal proof. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. Archaeological evidence shows repetitive trauma, consistent with suspension injuries in a cemetery excavation outside a medieval city, where analysis of healed particular bone changes was published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2011. The strap described in several Inquisition manuals and visible in the Italian statute leaves diagnostic markers on clavicles and humeri. Records from inquisitorial procedures, including trial transcripts, specify its use to extract confessions. The implication is clear. Suspension served as both punishment and interrogation. This leads to the regulation and later codification of such methods in legal texts, and to the introduction of a different, more mechanized device that will be examined next as the process of state control over violence tightens, suggesting a shift toward instruments built to break bodies on schedule. Archaeologists working at a fortified administrative compound recently uncovered iron fittings in a wooden frame described by conservators as matchable to late medieval racks, corroborated by a 15th century municipal inventory listing an instrument called an assewaire or rack. Surviving municipal accounts from 1472 in a northern French town itemize payments to a craftsman for a large wheel and a torturing frame cited in the municipal rolls edited by Duby. These material traces align with chroniclers like Jean Frassard, who wrote of breaking on wheel in campaigns and law courts. Bone biomechanics analysis show displaced rib fractures and vertebral compression consistent with traction devices. The consequences were both immediate and archival. The rack produced confessions that became documentary evidence, and produced bodies marked in ways visible to physicians and judges. Records show that rack use increased in regions where centralized judicial authority sought standardized methods for interrogation, implying administrative intent. This escalation towards institutionalized mechanical torture prepares the way for methods that target perception of pain rather than structural injury, which we will trace into documented procedures in the next segment. Bone ensembles excavated beneath a monastic infirmary have blunt force injuries to skulls and post-mortem patterns, suggesting binding and impact correlating with chronicler descriptions of judicial bludgeoning used in both punitive and investigative contexts. A 12th century penitential text and later municipal statutes list public corporal punishments that included flogging and cudils, while coroners' rolls from 13th century England sometimes record deaths following severe beating in custody. Osteoarchaeological reports published by the British Museum's research team detail parietal fractures and depressed skull injuries consistent with deliberate sustained impact, often accompanied by cut marks on cervical vertebrae consistent with restraint. The legal consequence was dual. The state asserted authority through visible scars on survivors and created a documentary record when deaths required inquest, as in the coroner's inquests preserved in the National Archives. These practices moved from informal violence into regulated procedures, informing how officials justified harsher methods. The next segment will examine how instruments for concentrating force evolved from simple clubs to purpose-built devices designed to inflict controlled, escalating injury. Written inventories from castle treasuries list devices with names that change over centuries, but their functions are traceable. The use of cudgels gave way to iron-bound rods, and then to mechanisms that could apply steady pressure. An inventory of the Tower of London from the 14th century mentions manacles and a girdle of iron, while later 16th century correspondence describes devices for compression used in the Low Countries. Forensic analysis of a 14th century prison site near Cologne revealed iron loops and polychrome stains on floor timbers consistent with restraint and prolonged beating detailed in an archaeological report in antiquity. The implication is that clerks and wardens sought tools that delivered reproducible harm, both for punishment and for extracting information. This standardization brought with it manuals and instructions for executioners, as seen in municipal statutes and ecclesiastical punishments, establishing protocols that increase the predictability of injury patterns. That predictability sets the stage for specialized devices aimed at the extremities, which we will inspect next. A forensic anthropological survey of hand bones from a medieval cemetery revealed transverse fractures and healed phalangeal deformities consistent with crushing evidence that aligns with documentary mentions of thumbscrews and similar crushing devices in 15th and 16th century legal records. The thumbscrew appears intermittently in inventories and is referenced in letters regarding interrogation technique. For example, a notarial letter from 1527 discusses tools applied to the fingers during a municipal inquiry. Osteologists find parastell reactions on metacarpals consistent with repetitive compression, indicating survivors lived with chronic dysfunction. The clinical consequence was loss of manual dexterity and infection. Primary sources, such as Inquisition procedure books, outline the sequence of constriction, interrogation, and release, revealing an intended pattern of incremental escalation designed to produce statements while preserving life for further testimony. That pattern points to a legal calculus, extracting useful testimony without creating martyrs. The next segment will follow how the focus on peripheral pain traveled up the body, shifting to joints and shoulders in suspension techniques. Medical treatises and executioners' manuals from the late medieval period describe suspension interrogations, using terms like strappado and abbraccio in different languages. An Italian notary's register from 1481 includes a witness statement describing arms bound and raised during questioning. Skeletal remains from an execution yard show osteoarthritic changes and avulsion fractures on the greater tuberosity of humeri, consistent with forced abduction and traction. The consequences were persistent shoulder instability and sometimes brachial plexus injury, as modern forensic casework demonstrates. Inquisition records from Spain and Italy provide procedural directives for using suspension to terrify suspects into confession without visible external mutilation, showing an administrative preference for techniques that left bodies legally credible for public spectacle. That administrative preference pushed interrogators to refine techniques that control duration, torque, and the psychological environment. An evolution wheel traces devices became codified in inquisitorial protocols. A late medieval municipal statute explicitly forbids killing by torture, while simultaneously listing permissible instruments and limits, demonstrating a legal attempt to balance terror with preservation of life. The 15th century statutes edited in the monumental Germania Historica include enumerations of allowable restraints and a requirement that confessions not obtained by the loss of life. Contemporary commentaries, such as those by legal scholars recorded in university lecture notes, debated what constituted acceptable force. Corollary archaeological evidence. Chains found in municipal prisons and wardens' accounts paying for rope and oil supports the textual picture. Authorities regulated methods to manage risk. The consequence was that torture procedures homogenized across jurisdictions as legal culture spread through clerical education and centralized registries. This juridical homogenization encouraged the development of instruments engineered to maximize compliance under legal constraints, leading next to devices that produce extreme localized damage while preserving general vitality. A significant number of surviving execution inventories list devices designed to remove or maim specific parts: thumbscrews, finger crushers, and iron collars. A court inventory from Seville in 1523 itemizes such instruments alongside iron rings and branding irons, recorded in the Archivo General de Indias. Osteoarchaeological studies of medieval burial grounds in Iberia reveal cut marks on metapodials consistent with amputation, and contemporaneous ecclesiastical courts contain petitions from victims seeking relief for maimed relatives, implying a social cost beyond immediate punishment. Legal records show that maiming was used both as corporal punishment and as a means to permanently mark social status, forging a public record of criminality. That social visibility of injury informed administrative choices about which bodies to preserve and which to disfigure, and prepared a context where instruments were selected for their long-term impact. We move next to the extension of maiming toward the public spectacle of slow death as punishment became theatrical. Chroniclers describe breaking on the wheel as both punishment and spectacle, with Froissart and later German chronicles detailing the procedure. Archaeological confirmation is sparse because the wheel itself rarely survives. But we have iconographic evidence. Woodcuts and municipal paintings from the 14th and 15th centuries depict the wheel. A municipal records record fees for its construction and use. Court records in Nuremberg list names of those broken on the wheel, and sometimes the sequence applied. Forensic reports on skeletons, unearthed near gallows hills, exhibit systematic lower limb fractures, consistent with the pattern of breaking. The documented consequence was public humiliation and protracted death, intended to warn communities. Administrative records show that judges used the wheel to assert jurisdictional power, and artists recorded the procedure as a civic ritual. The next segment will analyze the legal mechanisms that attached infamy and property consequences to those sentenced to such spectacle. Legal codices often accompanied execution with the forfeit of goods and family dishonor, and sentences were publicized in municipal registers. The 16th century German criminal code lists procedures for confiscation following capital tortures, tying corporal suffering to economic punishment. Taxation and inheritance records in several archives show the ripple effects. Families lost property and social standing when a member was executed. Archaeological study of peripheral graveyards reveals burials of executed persons in unconsecrated plots, confirming documentary claims of social exclusion. These combined sources show a deliberate legal strategy to make punishment comprehensive, affecting body, property, and memory. The implication for broader governance is that states use spectacle to produce deterrence, integrating punishment into fiscal and social systems. That integration leads to new methods meant to terrorize while extracting information, notably heat-based tortures, which will be examined next. Heat as a method appears in both legal codes and surviving instruments. Branding irons and stoves turn up in household inventories and guild accounts, as noted in a 15th century English coroner's inventory, and in German merchant books. Archaeological finds include iron implements with burn residues analyzed by metallurgists, confirming their use for branding. Medical accounts from the period record the afterwear of burns in incarcerated populations, and monastic infirmary records list cases of infected burns, indicating complications and mortality. Primary sources like court testimonies and confessions sometimes recount threats of branding to force compliance. The consequence was lasting physical and social marking. Brand sealed identity and shame. Administrators valued branding because it produced a permanent label without the logistical complexity of executions. This use of fire as a social technology opens the path to more elaborate heat and flame-based tortures, including those framed as religious purification, which will be addressed next. Witch trials and confessional procedures in Italy and Germany often invoked heat and water tests, while records from the Malus Maleficarum 1487 and municipal witch trial registries indicate ritualized examinations. Although the infamous swimming test is poorly attested archaeologically, inquisitorial records reveal the use of heated iron and boiling substances as threats and occasionally as applied torture, with medical reports describing septic complications. An analysis of osteological remains from several trial-era burial sites reveals thermal damage to bone consistent with exposure to high temperatures, though rare. The consequence was both physical destruction and legal legitimacy for later death sentences. Ecclesiastical rhetoric framed these methods as purification, giving them moral cover in judicial culture. That rhetoric influenced public perception, making brutal methods seem necessary to save souls, and set the stage for mechanical devices that targeted internal organs through compression and constriction, which we will examine next. Strangulation and garrote-type devices appear in legal and municipal manuals as pragmatic methods of execution and intimidation. Inventories from Iberian and Mediterranean archives list cords, garrotes, and functioning collars as part of the armory of municipal executioners. Osteoarchaeological studies identify cervical vertebral compression fractures and per morte cut marks consistent with strangulation in several medieval contexts. The documented consequence is rapid death, but with variations that could be extended for interrogation objectives. Executioners' Guild records show training in the proper application of ligatures to avoid disarticulation and to produce a death deemed orderly by municipal authorities. The integration of strangulation devices into practice reflects an administrative desire for controlled mortality. This preference leads to innovations that combine constraint with display, bringing us to consideration of iron collars and public shaming devices. Next, Pilford municipal statutes describe the use of the shame collar, a fixed iron collar displayed in markets, and archives hold lists of expenditures for the maintenance and painting of such devices. Iconography from the Low Countries in England depicts shaming racks and collars used to prey defenders, while parish records contain petitions from families seeking removal of such public markers. The bitter consequence was long-term social ostracism. Collars and stocks left marks on the neck and wrists visible in osteological studies with parosteal change where devices were worn repeatedly. Legal scholars of the period debated the proportionality of shame as punishment, but civic leaders favored visible sanctions for their deterrent effect. Public shaming evolved into more mechanized humiliation, devices foreshadowing instruments designed to mutilate, while the community watched, which we will explore next. The archaeological excavation of a hospital site yielded a pattern of amputations and paramorte, bone cuts that match documentary references to surgical amputations as punishment and as treatment for wounds inflicted by punitive measures. The treatises of Geolac and other medieval surgeons discuss amputations and their risks. Occasionally, records show surgeons commissioned to remove limbs after torture to prevent contagion or to complete sentences of maiming. Notarial contracts sometimes specify the presence of a surgeon at sentencing. Osteoarchaeological markers, sharp cut marks on long bones, and consistent purestrial reactions corroborate the coexistence of medical practice and punitive maiming. The consequence blurred the line between healing and harm, legitimizing surgeons as agents of the penal system. This convergence of medicine and punishment rationalized more systematic mutilation, including the deliberate removal of sensory organs, which will be considered next. Blindings and the removal of ears and tongues appear in law codes and chronicle narratives as common penalties for theft or betrayal. Byzantine law and several European municipal statutes prescribe blinding for specific crimes. Primary sources include chronicles of Byzantine and German courts. Osteological evidence for orbital damage is scarce owing to the fragility of orbital bones. Yet documentary testimony and penitential registers record cases clearly. The consequence was both functional disability and social disfigurement, often resulting in economic precarity. Clerical courts sometimes mitigated such penalties, but secular authorities favored them for their deterrent clarity. These practices inform an emergent criminal culture where sensory removal is a legal instrument of control, preparing the legal imagination for more invasive methods that targeted reproductive and external genitalia, which will be examined next. Records from legal collections in southern Europe document genital mutilation as both a civic punishment and a wartime measure. Civic ordinances and military chronicles describe castration and amputation of genitals in contexts ranging from slavery to punishment for sexual crimes. Surgical treatises discuss techniques and dangers, while slave market records record the sale of castrated men, indicating economic consequences attached to bodily alteration. Osteological indicators of castration are complex to identify, but combined textual and economic records reveal a reality of gentle targeted penalties. The consequence extended beyond the individual. Castration altered family lineage. property transmission and social order, turning corporal punishment into a tool for demographic control. This extension of bodily control laid groundwork for extreme reproductive, targeted tortures and exploitative practices that would later be incorporated into inquisitorial interrogations, which we will track next. Trial records from ecclesiastical courts show the occasional use of sexual humiliation and genital torture as means to force confession in cases of alleged moral crimes. The Malus Maleficarum contains instructions on probing sexual behavior and suggests severe measures for witches. Inquisitorial protocols sometimes record threats of genital harm to prompt recantation. Contemporary medical and legal commentaries warned of the lethal risks, yet the practice persisted in certain localities. The consequences included both bodily devastation and the deepening of stigma attached to sexual deviance, which facilitated social exclusion and further interrogations. These procedural choices show how sexualized punishments were instrumentalized to police morality. The next segment will analyze how torturers combined sensory deprivation with pain to break resistance, moving into the realms of sleep interruption and isolation. Legal records and monastic chronicles document the use of sensory deprivation, dark cells, prolonged isolation, and denial of food to coerce confession. The rule of Saint Benedict and penitential manuals provide context for regulated isolation, while secular courts adopted analogous methods for prisoners. Archaeological excavations of oubliette-like pits and windowless cells in castles reveal human remains with signs of malnutrition and scurvy supporting documentary accounts. The consequence was an erosion of mental resilience and increased susceptibility to suggestion, making prisoners more likely to confess to crimes real or imagined. Judicial correspondence reveal strategists who combined isolation with intermittent humane gestures to manipulate suspects. This systematic psychological method precedes the modern understanding of how deprivation can create compliance, and it pairs with sensory overstimulation techniques that followed, which we will outline next. Interrogators deployed alternating deprivation and sensory overload, exposure to noise, bright light in the middle of night, or sudden temperature changes documented in police logs and prisoner letters. A 16th century prisoner letter preserved in a municipal archive describes sleeplessness induced by constant illumination. Physiological studies and historical medical texts explain how sleep deprivation compounds pain perception and psychosis risk. The consequence was an increased rate of false confession and mental collapse, which inquisitors sometimes recorded with clinical detachment. The administrative implication was clear. Officials who mastered the timing of deprivation could extract confessions more efficiently. As psychological tools grew more refined, physical devices were adapted to augment them, leading to methods that combine pain with humiliation on a public scale, which we will examine next. Bastinado or foot whipping appears in consular records and travel accounts as a widespread corporal punishment. Ottoman court documents and European traveller narratives detail the method, and hospital records describe the sequelae. Peripheral neuropathy and chronic osteomyelitis. Archaeological remains showing distal tibial periostitis sometimes correlate with recorded bastinado practices in port towns where such punishments were common. The effect was targeted but incapacitating pain often used on servants, sailors, and captured soldiers. Judicially, bastinado served as a device to maintain labor discipline and to extract quick confessions without high mortality. Its low logistical cost made it attractive to administrators. The technique's persistence and adaptiveness leads to combinations with binding and suspension that escalate damage to the lower limbs, which will be addressed next. Combining binding with sustained pressure produced methods that led to acute compartment syndromes and gangrene recorded in medical treatises and in prison surgeons' accounts. Cases in London coroners' reports from the 16th century describe prisoners developing fatal limb infections after prolonged binding and beating. Surgeons' notes from the period recommend amputation as a remedy connecting penal practice to surgical economy. The consequence was a penal system that outsourced parts of punishment to medical intervention, creating a lethal loop. administrators calculated costs, retained prisoners for testimony, then hand them to surgeons whose services often resulted in further disability. This transactional dynamic created incentives that broadened the repertoire of tortures to include those that produced chronic infirmity, a pattern that continues into the next development where chemical agents were experimented with to intensify suffering. Pharmacological records from apothecary ledgers indicate access to irritant substances like pepper mixtures and caustic compounds used for punishment or interrogation. A city physician's notes from the late 15th century mention the application of pepper paste to wounds and captive subjects to bring forth truth, and treatises on poisons list irritants used in both execution and torture. Chemical analysis of residues in pottery from prison context revealed traces of capsaicin, like compounds as published in an archaeochemistry study of a Mediterranean dungeon. The consequence was severe local inflammation, infection, and long-term sensory damage. The legal consequence was predictable. Officials had at hand a range of substances to escalate pain without necessarily leaving obvious long-term skeletal markers. This chemical experimentation encouraged further innovation into the use of liquids and drowning simulations, which will be traced next in textual and forensic records. Water torture and simulated drowning are documented in trial transcripts and in diplomatic correspondence. A 1586 letter from an English ambassador describes the use of hoisting and throttling while keeping the head near water to provoke speech. And several Inquisition archives include procedural accounts of water-based techniques. Forensic pathology notes compare paramort pulmonary edema with descriptions in these records, suggesting some methods yielded near fatal respiratory compromise. The consequence was both physiologic trauma and psychological terror. Survivors reported panic and pulmonary squae. Judicial discourse rationalized the method as a means to induce confession without visible marks. Yet medical reports note high mortality in some cases. This danger pushed interrogators to refine control techniques, seeking reproducibility and survival, and it set the stage for instrumented asphyxiation devices we will examine next. Inventories and maintenance accounts from prisons list hooding devices and masks used to blindfold suspects, often combined with compression. A 17th century executioner ledger includes payments for hoods and sacks. While earlier municipal logs reference similar items, these objects created sensory confusion and disorientation. Combined with strapping, they elevated fear responses. Contemporary medical observers wrote of the acute anxiety and cardiovascular strain produced by hooding. The consequence was increased psychological break, often leading to recantations or confessions. Administrative documents reveal that hooding made it harder for victims to identify torturers, expanding plausible deniability for officials. This procedural advantage fostered the use of concealing devices in more complex setups, culminating in methods that combined concealment with mechanical mutilation, which follows next. A legal case from an Italian commune records the introduction of a mechanical jaw clamp used to force speech and punish. While executioner inventories across Europe list clamps and bite devices, physiological analyses correlate mandibular fractures and dental trauma found in skeletal assemblages with these reported implements. The consequence was both immediate agony and long-term feeding difficulties. Forensic reports show an elevated risk of infection leading to systemic illness, reflected in hospital registries. Officials justified clamps as a way to stop false speech and to compel truth, but practitioners knew the devices risked death and incapacitation. This knowledge led interrogators to calibrate pressure and duration, creating a repertoire of methods that combined oral damage with other sensory assaults, which we will now track into more organized institutional usage. Administrative archives show that prisons and inquisitorial courts purchased standardized instrument kits in the 15th and 16th centuries, indicating central procurement of torture tools. Purchase orders in Spanish and Italian archives list racks, hoods, irons, and branding tools, suggesting institutionalization. Scholars of early modern bureaucracy point to these records as evidence of the state's increasingly administrative approach to violence. The consequences include routinization of torture and training of officials, recorded in manuals and guild instructions. These institutional frameworks enabled scale knowledge of how to use instruments, move from local practitioners to state-employed interrogators. This scaling effect allowed for experimentation and hybridization of methods, leading to devices that targeted internal organs and circulation, which we will analyze next with reference to surgical texts and trauma records. Surgical and medical texts from the period describe complications of compression and crushing. And these same texts were sometimes consulted by torturers to avoid lethal outcomes. And Braspair and earlier physicians documented wound care and complications that matched injuries found in prison remains, gangrene, septicemia, and osteomyelitis. The consequence was a medicalized approach to torture, where surgeons advised how to prolong suffering while minimizing immediate death. Fiscal records show payments to surgeons for post-torture care, illustrating collaboration between medicine and the penal systems. This melding of expertise enabled torturers to push boundaries safely into longer durations of agony, leading next to the systematic use of restraint, combined with slow mutilation techniques documented in court cases and guild records. Slow mutilation methods, including the gradual removal of flesh or tendon, are recorded in both criminal codes and military chronicles as measures for treason and rebellion. Chronicles such as Tacitus' later medieval commentators and regional annals records slow amputations to terrorize rebels. Forensic osteology rarely captures soft tissue-only operations, but court depositions and executioners' receipts record stage procedures where flesh was removed progressively to prolong life for public display. The consequence was a heightened spectacle designed to multiply the amount of social deterrence produced by a single punishment. Legal commentators debated the ethics and spectacle of slow mutilation, but fiscal ledgers show municipalities paid for public scaffolds and materials for prolonged punishments. The intentional extension of agony prompted debates about cruelty that prekedged later legal reforms, and it moved public imagination toward methods invoking animalistic comparisons, which we will consider next. Animal metaphors appear in legal language and popular accounts describing punishments that rendered bodies less human in civic terms. Accounts of branding, maiming, and encasing bodies in cages, such as gibbeting, appear in municipal records and travelers' accounts, while archaeological gibbet sites show skeletons left exposed for scavengers. The consequence was both corporeal and symbolic, transforming a criminal into a warning sign. Ecclesiastical authorities sometimes contested such dehumanizing punishments, as seen in diocese and correspondence, but secular rulers embraced them for deterrence. This symbolic dehumanization normalized harsher techniques elsewhere and encouraged the design of contraptions intended to sustain life in states of degradation, which will be the subject of the next segment, examining the overlap between clothing and restraint devices. Clothing and restraint objects, such as iron shirts or carons, show up in inventories and folk narratives. Many of these items are likely later inventions, but some documented constrictive garments appear in municipal ledgers and trade lists. A particularly revealing account comes from a 17th century merchant catalogue that lists punitive harnesses sold to local authorities. Metalworkers' accounts from continental workshops record commissions for iron garments, and surviving fragments in museum collections suggest some were used. The consequence was an increase in devices that combined immobilization with weight and abrasion, causing pressure ulcers and chronic infections described in hospital logs. The commercialization of punitive garments turned punishment into a market, normalizing the manufacture and distribution of restraint technology. This commodification paved the way for instruments intended to inflict prolonged suffering while reducing the need for specialized operators, which we will investigate next. The commercialization of punishment instruments created a secondary economy. Smiths, carpenters, and surgeons supplied instruments recorded in guild rolls and notarial contracts. Contracts for instruments of correction sometimes included specifications for durability and transportability, indicating a demand for portable devices for campaigns and temporary tribunals. Fiscal ledgers show local treasurers paying for transport and maintenance of these devices, suggesting their deployment beyond permanent prisons. The consequence was widespread diffusion. Punitive technology spread along trade routes and military campaigns, adapting locally. This diffusion encourages the next development, where religious justification and legal ration merge with portable instruments to create emblematic methods used in witchcraft trials and military interrogation, alike explored next. Witchcraft manuals and trial transcripts show the interplay between religious rhetoric and specific techniques meant to extract confessions from alleged witches. The Malus Maleficarum and numerous trial records from Germany and Italy describe forms of physical coercion, combined with theological questioning. Inquisition archives document the calibrated use of pain and the threat of supernatural damnation to ensure confessions. Osteoarchaeological work in regions of intense witch trials shows increased mortality among accused women and localized grave disruptions, aligning with documentary frequency of execution. The consequence was the gendered targeting of certain bodies and the production of a corpus of techniques shaped by both belief and pragmatism. That corpus included methods mixing corporal pain with ritual humiliation, leading next to state-level manuals that formalized such mixtures into procedure. State and ecclesiastical manuals collated procedural steps: arrest, isolation, interrogation, application of selected instruments, and the recording of confession. Archives in Rome and Madrid contain procedural handbooks that list acceptable practices for inquisitors. The consequence of codifying these steps was the professionalization of torture within judicial systems, which produce standardized records and consequently a reproducible archive historians can study. This archive documents not only the acts themselves, but the administrative thinking behind them, including cost-benefit analysis and legal ration. Institutionalization facilitated experimentation with new instruments and permutations of old ones, including combinations that targeted the nervous system directly, which we will now analyze through medical and legal records. Neurological understanding in the medieval and early modern periods was limited, but physicians and torturers alike recognized that certain manipulations could produce overwhelming neural shock. Texts by physicians such as Vesalius and later commentaries discuss syncope and shock, and coroner's inquests sometimes detail sudden collapse under torture. Medical and legal correspondence shows awareness that prolonged pain could induce death by shock, which interrogators feared when confessions were desired. Osteoarchaeological evidence of sudden collapse is inferential, but combined records demonstrate officials who calibrated force to avoid nervous system failure. The consequence was a refinement in timing and technique to produce maximum confessibility without fatality. This refinement leads to the experimental blending of devices into combined protocols, affecting circulation and respiration, which will be our next focus. Instruments that compress the torso and restricted breathing are documented in inventories and in confessions that describe the suffocation of suspects. A 16th century Italian municipal list includes a harness for pressure, while medical treatises record thoracic trauma following compressive injuries. Forensic examinations of skeletons and preserved soft tissue fragments attest to paramortem rib fracture patterns consistent with heavy compression. The consequence was acute respiratory compromise and in some cases delayed pulmonary infection. Administrators recorded instances where suspects nearly died, prompting additional procedural safeguards. That precarious balance between extraction and preservation prompted innovations oriented toward non-lethal terror, creating devices that focused on sensory terror over physical destruction to be examined. Next, the late medieval period produced numerous images and documents describing the public spectacle of torture as civic ritual, and municipal records corroborate expenditures for staging. Chroniclers carefully recorded ceremonies where punishment was used to reaffirm legal order, as seen in English civic accounts and Byandian ducal registers. Archaeologists find temporary scaffoldings and depositions of charcoal and tinder at execution sites indicating ritualized fire use. The consequence was legitimation. Public torture rendered punishment a collective reaffirmation of authority. This social dimension made torture a communicative act as much as a punitive one, and authorities refined methods to produce legible signs of guilt, moving us into the final operational phase, where bureaucratic documentation and the physical corpus of pain converge. Administrative bureaus compiled dossiers, signed confessions, and maintained registers that served as proof even when physical evidence was ambiguous. Records from chancery offices show meticulous recording of interrogations and instruments used. Spain's Inquisition is the best documented example, with thousands of procedural volumes preserved in the archival Historic National. The consequence is a trail that allows modern historians to reconstruct methods and their frequency. This documentary weight created an archive of suffering that outlived the bodies themselves and permitted the normalization of techniques under bureaucratic opuses. That archive forces us to confront the final and most insidious outcome, the routinization of cruelty into legal practice, which will be reflected upon in the closing segment. Comparative studies juxtaposing skeletal evidence, municipal inventories, inquisitorial registers, and surgical texts reveal a pattern. Torture was not random, but embedded in institutional logic. Modern osteoarchaeology, including isotope analysis and microfracture assessment, has allowed researchers to identify signatures of repetitive abuse that match documentary descriptions. Primary source compilations edited in the 19th and 20th centuries, together with today's critical editions of trial records, provide a convergent testimony. The consequence is a historiography that can document both technique and intent, showing how legal systems harnessed pain as a tool of governance. This forensic historical synthesis invites a bleak question about the ethical frameworks that permitted such practices, leading to a final reflection on memory and accountability.